What would you do if the worst night of your life, the night everything broke, including your car, turned out to be the night everything changed? She had been living in a beautiful lie for 7 years. A mansion in Miami. A man who opened doors for her in public and closed them around her in private. A career she once built with her own hands. Now a ghost, erased so slowly she almost believed she had imagined it. The night she finally ran, she had $43, a half-empty tank of gas, and a plan that lasted exactly 6 blocks. That was when the car died. Right there. On a dark stretch of Coral Gables, in front of iron gates she had never noticed before, because you don't notice things like that when you're not looking for refuge. She didn't know whose house it was. She didn't know that the man behind those gates had his own ghosts, his own locked rooms, his own reasons for staying alone. She didn't know that grief, when it belongs to someone who refuses to lay it down, turns into a kind of wall. And walls, she was about to learn, sometimes have doors. She only knew one thing. She had nowhere else to go. And he opened the door. What follows is a story about 2 people who thought they were done with love, and the Miami night that proved them both wrong. About what it costs to rebuild yourself from the inside out. About the specific courage it takes to trust again when trust has been used against you. Stay with it. This one will stay with you. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a story. And drop a comment below. Have you ever had a breakdown, literal or otherwise, that turned into something beautiful? Aurelia King was 34 years old, and she had not made a decision entirely her own in 7 years. Not the apartment they moved into when they first married. Derek had chosen that. Not the car she drove, a silver Mercedes that he'd picked out, registered in his name, and that she had quietly understood was a leash disguised as a gift. Not the clients she no longer had, the contracts that had somehow always fallen through, the colleagues who'd stopped calling after Derek attended too many of her work events, smiled too wide, spoke to the wrong people in the right tone. She had been an interior designer, not a good one, an exceptional one. At 26, she'd landed the renovation contract for a boutique hotel in Wynwood, and the press had noticed. At 27, she'd been profiled in a regional design magazine, photographed in her studio, surrounded by samples and mood boards, and the particular kind of controlled chaos that belongs to people who know exactly what they're doing. At 27 and 3 months, she met Derek King at a gallery opening. He was charming in the way that certain men are, completely, exhaustingly charming. He made her feel, for the first time in her adult life, like she could put down the weight she'd been carrying, like someone else wanted to carry it for her. He asked about her work with a specific, flattering attention. He remembered details she had mentioned once in passing. He had a way of looking at her in a crowded room that made the room seem to contract until there was only his focus, and she had mistaken that intensity for devotion. It took her years to understand the difference between a man who sees you and a man who has decided to own you. The look is the same. What comes after is not. By 30, her studio was closed. The reasons were plausible. They'd moved. She was adjusting. The market was difficult. By 31, a contract she had pursued for 6 months fell through after Derek happened to have dinner with the client's business partner. She would not understand that connection until much later. By 32, she had stopped explaining the reasons to herself. By 34, she had a walk-in closet full of clothes Derek had chosen, and a phone with no professional contacts, and a life that looked, from every possible exterior angle, like success. The breaking point was not dramatic. That was the thing no one told you about the moment you finally decide to leave. It doesn't announce itself. There is no single explosion. There is just one ordinary Tuesday evening when Derek corrected the way she laughed at a dinner party. A small thing. A hand on her arm. A murmured comment that no one else heard. A laugh that died in her throat. And something in her chest said, "No more." She waited 3 weeks. She moved money, carefully, slowly, in amounts too small to trigger questions. She packed a bag that she kept in the back of her closet behind a row of coats. She researched shelter options in Broward County because she was smart enough to know that staying in Miami meant staying within his reach. She charged her phone every night to 100%. She practiced, in the silence of rooms she was alone in, the feeling of making a choice and not second-guessing it. On a Thursday in late October, she was 34, Derek was 41, and they had been married exactly 7 years and 2 months. She waited until he left for a dinner she had declined to attend. She took the bag. She took the car. She left the house key on the kitchen counter, and she did not look at the kitchen, which she had designed, and which had been one of the last beautiful things she'd created for someone else's life. She made it 6 blocks before the engine warning light came on. She told herself it was nothing. She made it another mile, then another half-mile. Then the car simply stopped, with the quiet, final dignity of a machine that had decided it was done. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment. Outside, the October air was warm the way Miami October always was, the pretense of autumn with none of the actual chill. The street was residential and dark, the kind of dark that exists between streetlights, and on her left, there were iron gates set into a long white wall. And beyond the gates, there was a driveway, and beyond the driveway, there was a house that was more light than structure. Warm windows floating in the dark like something imagined. Her phone had 17% battery. She had no roadside assistance. She had $43 and a bag that contained 3 days of clothing and a folder of documents she'd been quietly assembling for months. Birth certificate, passport, the business license for the studio she'd closed 4 years ago, the photographs from projects she'd worked on, the small paper evidence that she had existed before Derek King. She got out of the car. She walked to the iron gates. There was an intercom panel, brushed steel and discreet, and she pressed the button and waited. She was aware, pressing it, of how she must look. A woman standing alone on a Coral Gables street at 11 at night with a duffel bag at her feet. She was aware that this was not the image she had spent 7 years carefully maintaining. She was aware that she did not care. The voice that answered was neither warm nor cold. It was simply precise. Or, "This is private property." "I know. I'm sorry. My car broke down and my phone is almost dead. I just need to call a tow truck. I'm not dangerous. I'm just..." She stopped. She had been about to say she was fine, which was the sentence she had been saying for 7 years, and which was no longer available to her. "I just need 5 minutes and a phone charger." A pause. Long enough that she thought he'd simply walked away. Then the gates opened. His name, she learned later, was Ritai No. She did not learn it that night. That night he was simply the man who opened the door of an extraordinary house and looked at her with the expression of someone who had not been surprised in a very long time and was now recalibrating. The house was the work of someone with an eye, or of someone who had hired someone with an eye and then left them entirely alone. Clean geometry, high ceilings, materials that cost more when they looked like they cost less. She noticed all of it in the 3 seconds it took her to step across the threshold, and something in her professional mind woke up briefly before she shut it back down. This was not the moment for that. He led her to a kitchen that was larger than her old studio. There was a phone charger on the counter, the correct type, which she noted, and he gestured toward it and then leaned against the opposite counter with his arms crossed and watched her plug in her phone with the patient attention of a man who had decided to observe rather than engage. She called a tow service. They would be 45 minutes. She thanked the man. She still didn't know his name, and he said nothing, only uncrossed his arms and moved to the refrigerator and poured 2 glasses of water and set one on the counter near her without making it a gesture of hospitality. Simply a fact. She drank it. He watched. "You're not from this street," he said. It wasn't a question. "No. I was..." She considered her words. I was driving somewhere. At 11 at night? Yes. He didn't push. That was the thing she would remember first about Ritai No. The way he didn't push. She had spent 7 years with a man who made every silence into a demand, who filled every pause with the subtle pressure of expectation. This man simply waited, and the waiting was neither hostile nor warm. Just space. Real space. The kind she had forgotten existed. The bag, he said eventually, nodding toward the duffel she had set on the floor by her feet. She looked at it. Then at him. It's not what it looks like, she said. It looks like someone left in a hurry and brought the things that matter. A pause. That's exactly what it looks like. She didn't have an answer for that. He was right. The tow truck took an hour and 10 minutes, not 45. In that time, they sat in his kitchen, she on a stool at the island, he standing or moving in slow circuits, refilling her water once, producing a plate of something from the refrigerator that she didn't ask about but ate because she realized, sitting down, that she hadn't eaten since morning. They spoke in the way that strangers sometimes speak when the situation has stripped away the usual scaffolding of small talk, directly, carefully, with the specific precision of people who have learned not to waste words. She learned that he ran a private equity firm, that the house had come with the company he acquired 3 years ago. The previous owner had sold it to him as part of an arrangement he described with the flat brevity of someone for whom the transaction was more memorable than the property. That he had been in Miami for 3 years and had not yet decided whether he intended to stay. He said this without complaint or romance, the way someone states a fact about weather. It is what it is, and deciding takes as long as it takes. She offered that she had a car that was currently being dragged to a repair shop. That was all. He did not press for more, which was the first time she had been in a room with a man who did not press for more, and she sat with the strangeness of it quietly, the way you sit with an unfamiliar sound until you understand it is not a threat. When the tow truck came, he walked her out. The driver quoted her a number for the repairs that made her very still in a way she hoped wasn't visible. She thanked the driver. She stood on the sidewalk outside the iron gates and looked at the street in both directions and understood that she had no plan beyond this moment. "Where are you going?" Ritai asked from behind her. She turned. He was standing just inside the open gate, and the light from the driveway was behind him, and she couldn't read his expression clearly. "I haven't figured that out yet." Another of his silences. Then, "There are 4 guest rooms. None of them are being used. You can stay until you figure it out." She wanted to say no. Everything she had been taught, everything 7 years of careful management had trained into her, said that you do not accept help from strangers. You do not put yourself in debt. You do not allow yourself to need anything from anyone, because need was leverage, and leverage was power, and power was always used eventually. But the street was dark, and her phone was at 19%, and the shelter in Broward County didn't have availability until the following week, and she was 34 years old and she was tired. Tired in the way that goes all the way down, the kind of tired that isn't solved by sleep. "One night," she said. He nodded once and stepped back to let her through the gate. One night became 3. The car needed a part that had to be ordered. The shelter placement fell through again. Administrative delays, they said, in the tone of institutions that have learned to apologize for their own insufficiency without ever changing it. She spent the first full day in the guest room she'd been given, which had its own bathroom and a window that looked out over a garden that someone clearly tended with serious intention. And she sat on the bed with her folder of documents and her phone, and made calls and sent emails, and built the framework of a next step. She was methodical about it. She had been methodical about everything for 7 years. It was the only kind of power that had been left to her. Rite was largely absent. He had a home office and kept hours she did not track, and appeared in the common spaces with the rare, deliberate quality of a man who had arranged his life to require as little human contact as possible. She was careful. She made her own coffee in the morning and washed her cup immediately. She ate in her room or in the garden. She asked the housekeeper, a composed woman named Elena who seemed unsurprised by everything, where she could do her laundry and did it herself. She was aware, constantly, of the strangeness of the situation. She was in a stranger's house with a bag that contained her whole portable life. She had left her marriage in a car that was now in a shop she couldn't afford. She had been Aki for 34 years, someone who handled things. And now she was sitting in a garden in Coral Gables being quietly, practically tended to by a man who asked nothing and explained nothing and somehow made it feel less like charity and more like a simple fact of logistics. On the second evening, she was in the garden when he appeared. He had a glass of something in one hand, and he sat in the chair 2 chairs away from hers and looked at the garden without speaking. And she looked at it too. And the silence between them was companionable in a way that made her chest ache, because she had forgotten that silence could be that. Not tense, not loaded, not waiting to become something she had to manage. Just 2 people sitting with the same evening. "You're a designer," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "You've been looking at this garden the way someone looks at a problem they're solving, not admiring, analyzing." She considered denying it. "I was interior design, mainly, but I have opinions about gardens." "What are your opinions about this one?" she told him. The light at the south wall was being wasted. The angle of the afternoon sun hit the wall after the sitting area was in shade, which meant the timing was reversed, and the garden was coolest when it should have been warmest. The planting choices were beautiful, but they were a collection rather than a conversation. Each species selected for individual merit without consideration of how they spoke to each other as a composition. It was, she said, a garden designed by someone who loved plants, but had not yet decided what they wanted to feel while standing in them. She hadn't spoken about design in years. Not like this. Not with the fluency that comes from actually caring. And she felt, as she talked, something unlocking in her chest. Something that had been clenched for so long, she'd stopped noticing the tension. He listened with the quality she was beginning to recognize as distinctly his. Completely, without interruption, without the small affirmations that most people inserted to signal their attention. He simply received what she said, and turned it over, and then asked a question that showed he had understood not just the surface of her words but the shape beneath them. They stayed in the garden until the Miami dark became full, and the garden lights came on, and Elena appeared at the door with a look that was not quite a question. And Raite said they would eat outside. And they did. And that was the first meal they shared. Elena brought food that was too much for 2 people, which Aurelia would later understand was Elena's way of making a person feel expected. She did not tell him about Derek. Not that night. But she noticed, when she returned to her room, that she had laughed 3 times during dinner. She stood in her bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror and tried to remember the last time she had laughed like that. Unguarded, unmanaged, real. And she could not. On the 3rd day, he offered her the use of his home office for calls. She was in the middle of trying to reconstruct a professional presence from almost nothing. Her old portfolio was scattered across hard drives and project files she'd archived before the studio closed. Her contact list was sparse. Her reputation had not been actively maintained in 4 years. It was not impossible, but it was work, and she needed space to do it. She accepted. She was on a call with a former colleague, a woman named Priya, who had been carefully and consistently kind when the studio closed, and who now ran her own firm, and who, upon hearing Aurelia's voice, said, "I have been waiting for you to call for 3 years." When Rite appeared in the doorway of the office, she was sitting at his desk. She held up one finger and finished the call, and when she put the phone down, she was smiling in a way she couldn't suppress. "Good news," he said, not a question. "Maybe. Someone remembered me. Why wouldn't they?" She looked at him. The question was so simple and so direct that it disarmed her completely. Why wouldn't they? As if it were obvious. As if the years of erosion had been external weather, rather than anything that touched what she actually was. "I've been away for a while," she said. "Work doesn't forget talent. It just waits." He set something on the desk beside her, a coffee, the way she'd been making it in the mornings, which meant he had noticed, and left. She sat with the coffee and the lingering warmth of those words for longer than she intended. Not because they were romantic, because they were true, and she had not been told a true thing in a long time by someone who had nothing to gain from saying it. On the 5th night, she asked him. They had fallen into an informal rhythm, evenings in the garden or the kitchen, conversations that covered design and business and the particular texture of Miami as a city, a place that reinvented itself constantly and therefore never quite had to reckon with its history. He was sharp, and he was funny in a dry, understated way that she suspected very few people got to see, and he was, beneath all of it, deeply alone in a way she recognized because she had been alone inside a marriage for years. Not the same kind of alone. His was chosen. Hers had been constructed around her without her consent. But alone in the way that people are when the world they occupy doesn't quite fit them, when every room they enter is slightly the wrong temperature. "What happened?" she asked. They were on the terrace. The Miami skyline glittered in the distance, and the October air had finally found something that felt, if not like autumn, at least like permission to breathe. "To you. Before all this." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would redirect. Then he set down his glass. "My younger brother," he said. "He was 23. He came to work with me. My first real company, Soul, 12 years ago. I was 31. I thought I was protecting him by keeping him close." A pause. There was a deal that went wrong. Not wrong in a financial way. Wrong in a way that created enemies. People who wanted to make a point. He stopped. She waited. "He was in my car," Ritai said. "The car that was supposed to have me in it. I had changed my plans at the last minute without telling him. He didn't know I wasn't coming." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need filling. "He survived," Ritai said, and she registered the complicated mercy in that word. Survived. Not fine. Not recovered. Just survived. "He lives in Busan now. We speak twice a year. He says he doesn't blame me." A pause. "He means it. I am the one who can't accept it." He was 43 years old. She had done the math without thinking about it. And he had been carrying this for 12 years, alone, as far as she could tell. In houses that were too large for one person. In cities he had not decided whether to stay in a life arranged to minimize the damage he might do to anyone who came too close. He had built himself into the kind of man who could not be hurt, and had not noticed until this moment, or perhaps had always known and chosen it anyway, that being unable to be hurt and being unable to feel were the same architecture. "The thing about guilt," she said quietly, "is that it wears the mask of responsibility. It tells you that you're being accountable. But accountability asks, what can I do differently? Guilt just asks, what did I deserve to lose?" He turned to look at her. Really look, the way he rarely did, the careful gaze he usually kept slightly unfocused, aimed somewhere neutral, as if direct looking were a thing he had learned to ration. "Where did you learn that?" She almost smiled. 7 years of learning it the wrong way. That night she told him about Derek. Not everything. Not the full architecture of it. The thousands of small compressions that had added up to a person who barely existed. But enough. The studio. The contracts. The way he had made her feel, at the end, that she was the reason for her own diminishment. The Tuesday at the dinner party when something in her chest had simply said, "No more." She told it plainly, without the anger and without the self-pity, in the same tone she would have used to describe a building that had been poorly constructed. Here are the structural problems. Here is why it could not stand. Rite listened. He did not offer solutions. He did not say what she should have done or what she could do now. He simply listened, and at one point, his hand moved across the armrest between their chairs and rested near hers, not touching, just near, the way you'd sit beside someone who was cold without pretending you could make them warm. "You didn't leave the night you realized," he said, eventually. "No. I had to be ready. I had to have something to go toward. And now?" She looked at the skyline. "I'm working on it." He nodded. They sat in the quiet for a long time after that, and the quiet felt different than it had at the beginning of the week. Less like the absence of something, and more like the presence of a new thing, unnamed and unhurried, that neither of them had invited and neither of them was ready to name. She had known, somewhere in the part of her that was good at planning, that this was temporary, that Derek would look, that Miami was his city in the way that powerful men make cities theirs, through contacts, through presence, through the particular network that money builds over time. She had planned for this. She had simply hoped for more time. She had been in the house for 8 days when Elena found her in the garden and said, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering news they knew was not good, that there was a man at the gate. He had given the name King. The cold that moved through her was specific and physical. She knew it. It was the cold of a person who has spent years being found, being assessed, being adjusted. It was the cold of knowing exactly what was coming and exactly how it would sound, and understanding, somewhere she could not yet trust fully, that she was no longer the person who had to accommodate it. She went inside. Rite was coming down the hallway from his office. Elena had told him first. She understood. And he stopped when he saw her face, and something in his own face settled into a stillness that was different from his usual quiet, more deliberate, more decided. "You don't have to go to the gate," he said. "If I don't, he'll come back. He always comes back. Let him." She stared at him. "You don't know him." "No, but I know this house. And I know you've been here 8 days, and in 8 days you've started to stand differently." He said it simply, as a fact. "That's not nothing. And I'm not sending you out to that gate alone." They went together. Derek King was standing at the intercom panel in a linen shirt and the expression he wore in public, the one that suggested he was a reasonable man in an unreasonable situation. He was still 41. He had the kind of presence that filled a room when he wanted it to. He saw her through the gate, and his face did the thing it always did, a performance of relief over a substrate of cold. "Aurelia, thank God. I've been worried sick." She said nothing. His gaze moved to Rite, beside her. A calculation happened behind his eyes, the kind Derek had always been good at, the rapid assessment of who someone was and what they represented and how much of a problem they might be. "I don't know who you are," Derek said, "but my wife has been missing for over a week. I'd appreciate it if you'd let me speak to her privately." "She's not missing," Rite said. "She's here. Aurelia." Derek's voice shifted. The public warmth thinned slightly at the edges. This was the voice he used when he needed her to understand that they were having a conversation about what he wanted without having the conversation out loud. "Come home. Whatever happened, we can talk about it. You know I love you." She had heard those words so many times. She had felt them as weight so many times. Standing on this side of the iron gate, with the house behind her, with 8 days of something that had started to feel like oxygen filling her lungs, she heard them as what they had always been. Not a statement about her, but a statement about possession. "I'm not coming home, Derek." The shift in his face was subtle. He was good at subtle. "We're married. I have rights." "You have a lawyer," Rite said. His voice was even and entirely without aggression, which somehow made it more final than anger would have. "Use the lawyer. This gate doesn't open for you." Derek looked at him for a long moment. Men like Derek were good at assessing threats. They spent their lives doing it. Whatever he saw in Ritai No, the stillness, the certainty, the particular quality of a man who had already decided and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up, made him recalculate. "This isn't over," Derek said. "No," Aurelia agreed. "It's just started." She turned and walked back toward the house. She heard the gate remain closed behind her. She heard Ritei's footsteps following. She did not look back, and it was the first time in 7 years that not looking back was a choice, rather than a survival strategy. She felt it in her spine, that straight, clear feeling of a person walking toward something rather than away from it. He found her in the kitchen an hour later. She was making tea she didn't want, which was what her hands needed to do. "Thank you," she said, without turning around. "You didn't need me there." "No, but it helped." She turned. He was leaning in the doorway again, that particular posture of his, present without intruding, available without insisting. "Ritai, I need to tell you something." He waited. "I think I'm starting to—" She stopped. Started again. "Being here has been— you have been—" Another stop. She set down the mug. "I'm doing the thing where a woman runs from one man and walks into the orbit of another and calls it rescue." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you think this is?" "I think I need to be careful. I've spent 7 years letting someone else define the space I occupied. I need to define my own space before I—" She stopped again. "Before anything else." He nodded slowly. And then he said something she did not expect. "You're right." She blinked. "I'm not Derek King, but you don't know that yet. Not in the way that counts. You know it rationally. You need to know it the other way." He pushed off from the doorway. "Priya offered you a project." She stared at him. "How do you know about that?" "You said her name after your call, and you smiled in a way you hadn't before." He walked to the counter and lifted his own mug. "Take the project. Find a place to live. Do the work that's yours. If—" He paused. The pause had a different quality than his usual ones. It cost him something. She could see it. The way he managed his words, the way he managed everything, carefully. But this particular word was harder to manage. If there's something here worth coming back to, it'll still be here. Her chest did something complicated. "That's very reasonable of you," she managed. "I've been unreasonable for 12 years. The smallest lift at the corner of his mouth. "I'm trying something different." She looked at him in the kitchen light. This man who had opened a gate for a stranger and asked nothing, who had made coffee exactly the way she liked it without being told, who had stood beside her at the iron gate like it was simply the obvious place to be, who was now telling her to leave so she could come back whole. She thought about the 12 years he'd spent in houses that were too large. She thought about what it must have cost him to say, "If it's worth coming back to." She picked up her mug. "I'll come back," she said. Not a promise exactly. More like a declaration of intent. He didn't say anything. But he didn't look away, either. She moved into an apartment in Brickell 3 weeks after leaving his house. It was small, and the kitchen window looked directly into the wall of the building next door, and she loved it with a ferocity that surprised her, because it was hers. The lease was in her name. The furniture, which she assembled herself from second-hand shops, and one very satisfying Saturday at a market in Little Havana, was chosen by no one but her. The dishes were a pattern she had loved at 26, and had never been allowed to use because Derek preferred white. She called her attorney. She filed. Derek's response was immediate and strategic. A counter-narrative, requests for asset disclosure, the language of a man who intended to make the process as expensive and exhausting as possible. Her attorney, a woman named Sandra who had been in family law for 20 years and had seen everything, said, "He wants you to settle for less because he knows he can't win. Let him exhaust himself." Aurelia let him exhaust himself. Meanwhile, The project with Priya was a commercial renovation, a restaurant in the design district, an owner with strong opinions and a generous budget, and the sense to hire someone whose aesthetic he trusted. Aurelia walked the empty space on a Tuesday morning and stood in the middle of it and felt the old fluency return. Not cautiously, all at once, like a language she'd only stopped speaking, never forgotten. She stood in that empty room with its bad lighting and its awkward traffic flow and its untapped potential, and she thought, I know exactly what this wants to be. She worked the way she had worked at 26, with the full weight of herself, and it was the most herself she had felt in years. She made decisions quickly and stood by them. She pushed back on the contractor twice and was right both times. She solved the light problem in the main dining room in a way that Priya would later describe to a journalist as unexpectedly elegant. And when she read that phrase, she sat with it for a moment because unexpected was the word for someone who had come out of nowhere, and she had not come out of nowhere. She had simply come back. She did not call Rite. She thought about him, often, and in the specific way that you think about someone who has become a reference point, someone against whom you measure the quality of spaces and silences. She noticed when a room had the quality his rooms had. Considered, honest, unperformative. She noticed when a conversation lacked the quality his conversations had, that sense of actual contact, two people genuinely meeting rather than performing meeting. She noticed, more than anything, that the standard he had set simply by being himself in her presence was a high one, and that this did not frighten her. It clarified things. She did not call him because she had meant what she said. She needed to know who she was before she let herself want something again. She needed her name on a lease and a project in her hands, and the particular quiet confidence of a woman who had rebuilt herself, not for someone else, but for the simple reason that she deserved to be rebuilt. 6 weeks after leaving his house, she had that. 7 weeks after leaving, Priya told her the restaurant owner had referred her to a developer who was looking for a lead designer on a residential project in Coconut Grove. The budget number Priya quoted made Aurelia sit down. 8 weeks after leaving, on a Friday afternoon in December, she was 34, he was 43. The Miami December sun was the particular gold that happens in the hour before it sets. She drove to Coral Gables and parked on the street outside the iron gates and pressed the intercom. The voice that answered was exactly as she remembered it, precise, neither warm nor cold. This is private property. She smiled. She hadn't planned to. I know. I was here before. My car broke down. A pause. Longer this time. I remember, he said. The gate opened. He met her at the door. He looked the same. She hadn't expected him to look different. 8 weeks was not a long time. But she had been so in her own head about this moment that seeing him as simply himself, unheroic and real, wearing a gray shirt and holding a pen he'd clearly just picked up and forgotten to put down, loosened something in her that had been held tight the whole drive over. You look different, he said. Good different, or like yourself. The way I imagine you looked before. She stood in the doorway, not coming in yet, standing in her own decision. I have an apartment, she said, in Brickell. The kitchen window looks at a wall, but I have a very good lamp. A pause. I have a project in the design district and a lead on something in Coconut Grove. I have a lawyer who says Derek is going to settle within 2 months because he can't win. I have dishes in a pattern I chose myself. He listened with that complete hand-receiving attention. I came here, she continued, because I wanted you to know that I'm not here because I need to be. I'm here because I want to be, and I wanted to know the difference before I came. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not empty. Then he stepped back from the door, not away, but making space. The way he always made space. It was, she understood, his specific language of welcome, not pulling toward, but opening to. There's something I need to tell you, he said, She came inside. "I called my brother," he said. "Last month. Not the twice-a-year call, a real one. Longer." He set the pen down on the hall table. He asked me what had changed. I didn't know how to answer him. "What did you say?" That I'd been reminded that surviving something and living with the guilt of it are two different choices, and that I'd been making the wrong one for a long time. She felt the weight of those words, how much they had cost him, how much it meant that he had said them to someone other than her first, to the person they were actually owed to, that he had done the harder thing before the easier thing, that he had not waited for her return to begin. How was it? The call. He looked at the middle distance for a moment. Hard. And then, lighter, than it's been in 12 years. She nodded slowly. "I'm not fixed," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I have 12 years of habit. I still default to distance. I still don't know how to—" He stopped. "That's okay," she said. "I'm not fixed either. I'm rebuilding. That takes time. I'm just asking if you want to—" She paused. "Not move in, not anything dramatic. Just have dinner. See what this is when neither of us is in crisis." He considered this. The Miami evening was coming in through the windows. Outside, the garden was going blue-gold the way it did at this hour, the south wall catching the last of the light at exactly the wrong angle, just as she had observed it all those weeks ago. "Elena made too much food again," he said. She laughed, unguarded, unmanaged, real. "Then we should do something about that," she said. Dinner was not the beginning. It was a continuation of something that had already begun in a kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, with 2 glasses of water and a silence that felt, improbably, like safety. What followed was unhurried. That was the word for it. After years of a relationship that had always felt slightly rushed into, rushed through, rushed toward a version of things that served someone else's timeline, this was something that had patience in its bones. They were 2 adults who had been injured in different ways, and had both, separately, decided they were not interested in pretending otherwise. There was something freeing about that, something that removed the performance from it and left only the thing itself. He came to the design district once, during the restaurant renovation. He did not offer opinions. He looked at everything carefully, and then said she had solved the light problem in a way he hadn't expected, which she understood was high praise from a man who measured his words carefully. She showed him the mood boards for the Coconut Grove project. He asked questions that revealed he had been thinking about space and people, and how the two related to each other in ways that surprised her. He was not an aesthetic person in the conventional sense. She was learning, but he understood function, understood purpose, understood the way environments shaped behavior. They were different kinds of intelligence reaching toward the same thing. She had dinner at his house most Fridays. Sometimes she stayed. More often she drove home to Brickell and her good lamp and her deliberately chosen dishes. She was not ready to blur those edges, and she said so, and he did not push. Which she was beginning to understand was not distance, but respect. 2 things that looked the same from the outside, but felt entirely different. Distance says, "I don't want you close." Respect says, "I want you close enough that close is your choice." In February, she was still 34. He was 43. Her attorney called to say Derek had settled. The terms were not everything she might have wanted, but they were fair, which was more than she had expected. And they included the return of professional documentation that Derek had quietly retained access to. Old emails, proposal files, a hard drive she had believed was lost. Evidence of her own history, evidence that she had existed and worked and been good at something long before he had tried to make her doubt it. She sat in her Brickell apartment with the hard drive in her hands, and she cried for the first time since the night the car broke down. Not from grief, exactly. From the particular release of something that had been clenched for a very long time finally letting go. From seeing, in the folder names on that hard drive, King Street Hotel, Wynwood Residential, Brickell Penthouse 2019, a record of herself that was real and complete, and that no amount of quiet sabotage had actually erased. She had simply stopped being able to see it. She called Raite. He picked up on the second ring. She didn't say much, just, "It's done." Derek signed, and he said, "Come over." And she drove to Coral Gables, and the gates opened before she reached the intercom, which meant he had been watching for her, which meant more than she let herself say out loud. She sat in the garden with him until the Miami night was full around them, and she talked about the hard drive, about the projects she'd forgotten she'd done, the proposals she'd written at 27 and 28 and 29 with such complete confidence, the photographs of finished rooms where every choice had been hers. And he listened. And at some point during the listening, his hand moved to hers on the armrest, and this time it didn't just rest near. It stayed. In October, she was 35. He was 44. And the Miami October was doing its usual impression of summer. She stood in the middle of a finished space in Coconut Grove and let herself feel the particular satisfaction of work completed exactly as imagined. The apartment was her design from foundation to finish, a private residence for a client who had trusted her completely and whom she had rewarded with the full weight of what she was. The materials were honest. The light was considered. Every room had a center of gravity that drew you in and a quality of space that let you breathe. It was, as Priya told the design press when they covered it, unmistakably the work of someone who understood not just how rooms looked, but how they felt to exist inside. Ritai arrived at the end of the walkthrough. He had been in Seoul for a week, his first time back in 9 years, a trip that had included 2 days in Busan with his brother. He looked tired in the way that people look after something important has happened, and the body hasn't caught up yet. He looked at the apartment the way he'd looked at her garden on their first evening, carefully, seriously, with real attention. Then he looked at her. "This is you," he said, all the way through. She understood what he meant, not just the design, the fact of it, the fact that she had stood in an empty space with the full weight of herself and made something that had not existed before. The fact that the space was honest and considered and unperformative, and those were not coincidences. "How was Busan?" she asked. He considered. "Long. Good. My brother he's well. He has a daughter now. She's 2. A pause. "He wants to visit. Miami, maybe in the spring." "I'd like that." He crossed the room toward her. Outside, the Coconut Grove afternoon was warm and green and full of the specific light that Miami made in October. And the apartment was all hers, and his arrival in it was not a diminishment of that, but an addition to it, the way a well-placed window adds to a room rather than taking from it. He stopped in front of her. "I have something to ask you." She looked at him. "The Coral Gables house," he said. "The garden. I've been thinking about what you said that first night, about the light problem at the south wall." A pause. She saw the smallest movement at the corner of his mouth. "I'd like your professional opinion, and maybe..." Another pause. This one longer. "I'd like you to stay long enough to see it fixed." She looked at him. The man who had opened a gate for a stranger. The man who had made coffee exactly the way she liked it. The man who had told her to leave so she could come back as herself. The man who had called his brother. The man who was, she understood, asking her not for rescue and not for resolution, but for something much harder and much better than either. For presence. Continued. Chosen. Mutual presence. "That's a long-term project," she said. "I know." The corner of his mouth again. "I've been told I'm finally learning to think long-term." She was still laughing when he kissed her for the first time. Not the first time she had expected it. Not in a grand gesture. Not in a crisis. Just in an afternoon in October in a room she had built from nothing. In a city she had learned to live in on her own terms. In a life that was, finally and fully, and without anyone else's fingerprints on it. Hers and his, if she wanted. And she did. If this story moved you, you know what to do. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me which moment got to you the most. The next one is already waiting. See you there.